Cool. Welcome everybody to our tutorial. So this tutorial is about automated mechanism design, which is an exciting new approach to for mechanism design, where we use machine learning and optimization to design mechanisms based on data. Okay, so this is really an exciting area at the intersection of mechanism design, machine learning, and optimization. Okay, and in terms of the structure of the tutorial, Ellen will start with a brief overview of what mechanism design is. Then Tuomas will tell us about automated mechanism design and some empirical successes of this field. Then we'll have a break. And after the break, I'll talk about formal guarantees, in particular sample complexity guarantees for automated mechanism design. And then Ellen will tell us more formal guarantees and also end by putting the whole work into a broader perspective. And she'll also present some exciting open questions. With this, Ellen will start.
I say who Ellen is.
Okay, thank you.
And who is Ellen? I need to, thank you, Thomas, for reminding me. Ellen is a brilliant PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University, advised by me and Tuomas.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. So let's get started. And I just want to say that this first part might be pretty basic for all of you if you're coming from EC, but since this is FCRC, I want to give kind of like a kind of elementary overview of mechanism design, and then I promise that there will be lots of new material for everybody in this talk. Okay, so mechanism design is a field of game theory with significant real-world impact, and it encompasses areas like pricing and auction design. To start off with, I want to give a couple of examples of large-scale mechanisms in the real world. The first is sourcing auctions, and this is something that Tuomas, who will speak next, has worked a lot on, and in fact, he's moved around billions of dollars in sourcing auctions. Sourcing auctions are basically the way in which large companies like Procter & Gamble get the goods and services they need to run their operations. Another large-scale auction are auctions that the government runs, for example, for wireless spectrum. So traditionally, wireless spectrum has been used by like radio broadcasting companies, for example. But in the past few decades, new use cases have arisen for wireless spectrum, like broadband. So the government has been buying this radio spectrum from the radio broadcasters and reallocating it in what hopefully will be a more efficient allocation. And of course, large companies like Amazon have to choose how to sell every item, how to price every item they sell. And other large internet companies like Google and Facebook obtain huge amounts of their revenue from ad auctions. So for example, when you search for something on Google, Google is going to run an almost instantaneous auction for the opportunity to show you an ad. And they get huge fractions of their revenue from these auctions. This tutorial is about automated mechanism design, where the goal is to use optimization and machine learning and data to design mechanisms. And hopefully this should help overcome challenges that have been faced by manual approaches to mechanism design. Amazingly, we still don't even know how to sell 2 items in a revenue maximizing way. So these more manual approaches have faced some serious roadblocks. In this tutorial, we're going to cover optimization algorithms and also prove some statistical guarantees for these optimization algorithms. We believe our techniques for proving these statistical guarantees, which we'll go into in depth, are of broader interest beyond mechanism design to machine learning theory more generally. Okay, so just to start off with, I'm going to begin with some mechanism design basics. So, and I'll go through this a little bit quickly, just because this is easy. So in a mechanism, of course, there are items for sale and buyers who want to buy them, and these selling mechanisms that we're going to concentrate on here. And at a high level, a mechanism determines who's going to get these items and how much they're going to pay. So for example, maybe we have 2 buyers, and this buyer has value of 2 for the coffee, value of 3 for the muffin, and value of 6 for the bundle of the coffee and the muffin. And this buyer has other valuations. A very common mechanism that we see every day are posted price mechanisms. And basically here, the mechanism designer or the seller sets a price per item, and the buyers buy the bundle of goods that maximizes their utility. And their utility is their value for the items minus the price. So for example, this buyer, their utility for the coffee, well, their value is 2, the price is $1.50, so their utility is 50 cents. Their utility for the muffin is negative 50 cents, and their utility for the bundle is $1. So they're going to end up buying the bundle of the coffee and the muffin. Another very classic mechanism is the first price auction. So let's say that we have one item for sale, this painting. And in a first price auction, the bidders all submit bids for the item, and the highest bidder wins, and they pay their bid. So for example, in this setting, the blue bidder here is going to win, and they're going to pay their bid of $9. A variation on the first price auction, which has many nice properties that we'll talk about soon, is the second price auction. And so here, there's again one item for sale, and the highest bidder again wins, but he pays the second highest bid. So this time he's going to pay $7. And a way that we can sometimes get more revenue in this second price auction format is to add a reserve price. So the auctioneer sets some reserve price, which is just a real number. And in this case, the highest bidder wins so long as his bid is above the reserve price, and he pays the maximum of the second highest bid and the reserve. So in this case, again, the highest bidder, this blue bidder, is going to win, so long as his bid is above the reserve price. So for example, if the reserve price is $8, he is going to win because his bid is above the reserve, and he's going to end up paying the maximum of the second highest bid in the reserve. So that's the maximum of $7 and $8, so it's going to be $8. But if we set the reserve too low, then we're going to revert back to the second price auction. So if we set the reserve price to $6, for example, we're still going to get revenue of $7 because that's the maximum of the second highest bid in the reserve. The second price auction is also commonly known as the Vickery auction, because it was introduced in 1961 by Vickery. And he won the Nobel Prize a few decades later. And this mechanism has been studied extensively in the Econ CS literature. Okay, so those are a few basic examples of mechanisms, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. So now I'm just going to set a little bit of notation. Throughout this tutorial, we're going to be talking about settings where there are M items and N buyers. Each buyer, I, is going to have a value, Vi of B, for every bundle of items. And we're going to use this vector notation, Vi, to denote bidder I's value for all 2 to the M bundles of items. So we might also refer to this as the buyer's type. Okay, so just to give you an example, again, let's say that we have 2 items, the coffee and the muffin. We are always going to assume the buyer's value for the empty set is 0. Maybe his value for the coffee is $2, value for the muffin is $3, and value for the bundle is $6. So this valuation vector Vi is going to be a vector of length 4. And here I've just superimposed the values onto these items. Okay, so a little more formally, a mechanism is always going to be defined by an allocation function and a payment function. The allocation function determines which buyers receive which items, and the payment function determines how much each buyer pays. The revenue is the sum of the prices. So we're going to denote this given valuation vectors V1 up through Vn for all N buyers. We're going to denote the revenue of a mechanism M as revenue M of V1 up through Vn. And sometimes, as we saw, for example, in the first and the second price auction, the buyer might submit a set of bids. And we'll denote this set of bids as Vi tilde, which is also a vector of length 2 to the M. And importantly, this Vi tilde, this set of bids, might not always equal the buyer's true values. So this brings me to two properties that we want our mechanisms to satisfy. The first is incentive compatibility, which means that the agent's bids will always equal their true values. A mechanism is incentive compatible if the agent's bids will always equal the true value. They're incentivized to bid truthfully. A mechanism is individually rational if the agents have nothing to lose by participating, and they're not going to walk away with negative utility. Okay, so just to make this a little more clear, I'm going to show you that the second price auction is incentive compatible, which means, again, that every bidder is going to maximize their utility by bidding truthfully. Their utility is their value for the item minus the payment times 1 if they win the item. So why wouldn't the buyer want to bid above their true value? Let's say that they won when they bid their true value. Well, if they increase their bid, they're going to keep winning, but they're still going to pay the second highest bid. So they have no incentive to bid above their true value in this case. If they lose when they bid their true value, and they move their bid above their true value, they might move it so high that they start to win. But at this point, they're going to have to pay something that's higher than their true value. So they're going to walk away with potentially negative utility. So they went from 0 utility to negative utility, so they have no incentive to do this. So we see they have no incentive to bid above their true value. And why not bid below their true value? Well, if they are the winner when they bid their true value and they shift their bid below their true value, then they might start losing. But in this case, they're going to go from positive utility to 0 utility. So they might as well not do that. And if they're the loser, they're going to stay the loser. So their utility will still be 0. So that we've seen they have no incentive to bid above their true value, no incentive to bid below their true value, might as well bid their true value. And the second price auction is also individually rational, which means that no bidder is worse off participating than not. But I'm not, and this is basically because if they bid truthfully, they're always going to pay something that's smaller than their true value. And if they lose when they bid their true value, they're not going to pay anything, and they're not going to win the item. So they're going to walk away with 0 utility. Okay, so I want to talk about incentive compatibility a little more formally. So I'm going to introduce an assumption that's been made for decades in economics. And it is also very natural from a machine learning perspective. So we're going to return to this assumption throughout this tutorial. And this assumption says that the buyer's values are defined by a probability distribution. So I have some latent distribution in my head, and when I go to a coffee shop, I basically draw some number from this distribution defining my value for a coffee. If that value is smaller than the price, then I'm not going to buy the coffee, but if it's greater than the price, I will buy the coffee. So just to make this clear, we're saying that these valuation vectors, V1 up through Vn, are drawn from a distribution, where Vi defines the buyer's values for all of these items. And this allows me to define some different kind of variations on incentive compatibility, which I'm going to come to later on in the tutorial. And to define these, we're going to think about kind of 3 different stages of the mechanism. The first is at the very beginning of the mechanism. Let's say that all of the agents know the distribution from which their values are going to be drawn, but nobody actually knows their true value yet. They only know the distribution. At this point, a mechanism is ex-ante incentive compatible if the bidder should be truthful in expectation over everybody's bids. Next, let's say that the bidders know their own values, but they still don't know anyone else's values. They just know the distribution from which it's drawn. In this case, we say a mechanism is ex-interim incentive compatible if the bidder should be truthful in expectation over everybody else's bids, no matter what their true value is. And finally, we have ex-post incentive compatibility, which says even given my own bid and even if I knew everybody else's bids, I should be truthful. Okay. And I'll return to ex-interim. Yep. Not yet, yeah. It's just in expectation over my own value, I'll be incentivized to be truthful. I can't improve my utility in expectation by changing my bid. Yeah. So yeah, you can think of it that way. But it's not important for the rest of this tutorial. But yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Okay.
But if you, I mean, the thing is that the ex-ante thing is rarely used in practice, but it does give some power in that you don't really worry about putting those constraints in a world where you already know your own realization, which could be bad. So the constraints are actually looser if they're the ex-ante constraints than the ex-interim constraints.
Okay. So, and we can also define ex-ante, ex-interim, and ex-post individual rationality, but I'm not going to do so here. And these notions of incentive compatibility were introduced by Hurwitz in 1972, and he also won the Nobel Prize several decades later. Okay, so now I just want to give you an idea of kind of a basic principle or a fundamental principle in mechanism design, which basically says that we can assume incentive compatibility holds without loss of generality. And so this is called the revelation principle. And it says that let's say we have some mechanism where the agents are incentivized to follow some fixed strategy. It might not be the truthful strategy. The revelation principle says at a high level, this is an informal statement, that there exists another incentive compatible mechanism with the same payments and allocation, essentially. And I can show you why this holds with a picture, pretty much. So we've got this original mechanism where the agents are incentivized to follow some fixed strategy. And we're going to turn this into a new mechanism, which is incentive compatible. And the way that we do this is we take the agent's preferences and we map them into some strategy formulator. Right? The same strategy formulator formulating the strategy that the agents are incentivized to follow for this fixed mechanism. And so our new mechanism is going to be both this strategy formulator mapped into the original mechanism. And of course, under this new mechanism, the agents are going to be incentivized to bid truthfully. Okay. And so colloquially, this means that the mechanism lies for the agents, so the agents don't have to. Okay, so that's incentive compatibility and individual rationality. And so now I want to start talking about revenue, which is the focus of this tutorial. So I'm going to start off by talking about the single item case, for which we know a lot. We have a really well-developed theory of single item revenue maximization. This was developed by Meyerson in 1981. He discovered this optimal single item mechanism. And by here, when I say optimal, I mean revenue maximizing. So just to give you a little bit of intuition behind Meyerson's optimal auction, let's think about what's the problem with the second price auction. Why isn't that revenue maximizing? Well, let's think about the case where there's some strong bidder and some weak bidder. So the plots I have here are density functions where we've got the value of this item along the x-axis, and we've got basically the density of each bidder along the y-axis. So if we were to run the second price auction for this situation, basically the strong bidder is always going to be winning, and they're always going to be paying the weak bidder's bid. So this leaves a fair amount of revenue on the table. What Meyerson's optimal auction does at a high level is boosts the weak bidder's bids, thereby creating kind of artificial competition for the strong bidder. And miraculously, it's able to do this, create this artificial competition while maintaining incentive compatibility. So now I'm just going to give you a brief description of Meyerson's auction. So let's say that each bidder i's value distribution comes from a distribution with a PDF Fi and a cumulative density function capital Fi, and the support is in 0, 1. So Meyerson's optimal auction maps, relies on this virtual valuation function. What this virtual valuation function does is it takes a value t, a real value t, and it maps it to t minus the probability that basically the bidder's value is greater than t divided by the density of t. Okay, so with this virtual valuation function, we solicit bids from the buyers. We map their bids through this virtual valuation function. And if everybody's virtual values are smaller than 0, then we don't allocate the item. Otherwise, we allocate the item to the buyer I star, who has the highest virtual value. And we charge that bidder her threshold bid, which you can think of as being the minimum she could bid and still continue winning. And in math, this is what it looks like. So it looks kind of complicated in math, but it's actually an intuitive number. Okay, and there are some really nice properties of Meyerson's optimal auction. One of which is when the buyer's values are IID, Meyerson's optimal auction is equivalent to a second price auction with a carefully chosen reserve, which is a pretty cool fact. And also Meyerson's auction was later extended to selling multiple units of an item. But remarkably, when we get to multi-item auctions, surprisingly less is known, despite a huge amount of work in this area from both the economics and the computer science community. And this is just a tiny sample of the papers that have looked into understanding structure of the optimal multi-item auction. Okay, and so next I'm going to hand the mic over to Tuomas, who's going to talk about automated mechanism design for multi-item settings. Thank you.
Okay, so sound good in the back? Okay, great. So yeah, I'll start to talk about automated mechanism design. And here the idea is that we are not going to do the traditional approach of doing mechanism design by paper and pen and trying to prove things analytically, but we are going to do it computationally. And so the idea is that we are going to solve the mechanism design as a search or optimization problem automatically. And we built a system for doing that. Can't believe it's already 17 years ago. It creates a mechanism for the specific setting at hand rather than a class of settings. So you might, if you're a theoretician, you're used to probably thinking about the beauty of theory is that it's very general. You prove something and then it applies to the whole generality of the scope. But that is also the weakness of theory when it's applied to mechanism design, in that it's for a general setting, and as you move to a more specific setting, you can actually do better. And I'll talk about examples of that. And here the idea is that because we're always designing for the specific setting at hand, you can actually do better than by coming up with something that works more generally. It can lead to greater value of the designer's objective than known mechanisms. One example is revenue maximization, and that's of course of great interest to this community, but this is true of other objectives as well. It sometimes circumvents economic impossibility results and always minimizes the pain implied by them. And what I mean by that is that in mechanism design, in economics, there are these results that say, okay, for this class of problems, this mechanism accomplishes properties X. And then for this broader class of problems, no mechanism accomplishes properties Y. But it could be that somehow in between, there are things that work or don't work. It's just not part of what's yet known. So one example of that is the Meyerson Satterthwaite theorem. from 1983 by Roger Meyerson and Mark Satterthwaite. It's a very general theorem that's a very general impossibility result that talks about trade. Even in a setting where you have one buyer and one seller and one item to trade, there's no way to trade efficiently. So let's say that Ellen and I are trading a car. The car should exchange hands whenever Ellen's valuation is higher than mine, if I originally have the car. But there's no way to do this even in a Bayes-Nash incentive compatible way. So there's always some inefficiency when you have two-sided asymmetric information. So that's what the theorem says, but in some work with my student A. Bothman, we actually ran some experiments to say, okay, does it really bite? And in a lot of settings, at least with discrete support points in the prior, it almost never bites. And even if it bites, you can minimize it with this type of automated mechanism design approach. Now, in all fairness to that impossibility result, it is actually universal if there are no gaps in the distribution. So then it's actually universal. But that's just an example of how you might be able to get around even these very seminal impossibility results by trying to come up with something that's setting specific instead of general. This can be used in new settings and for unusual objectives that haven't been studied yet, can yield stronger incentive compatibility and participation properties, participation meaning individual rationality, in that sometimes the general mechanisms just have these weaker constraints satisfied, but for the setting at hand, you might actually be able to satisfy the stronger constraints without any compromise in the objective. And it shifts the burden of design from human to machine. And that's, as computer scientists, that's something we always think is a good thing. How I got into this is through sourcing auctions. And if you think about the situation around kind of the mid to late 1990s, sourcing was largely a manual negotiation, but there was also what's called reverse auctions. They had just started in like 94, 95 by companies like Free Markets and others. And in a reverse auction, what you do, sometimes you lot some of the items together, sometimes not. And then for every lot, you run a descending price open cry auction until nobody wants to lower the price anymore. And then you allocate it to the cheapest bidder. Okay. So that's all fine and good and was very popular. There's a lot of kind of hype around it. But if you think about sourcing, these same sourcing teams in these big companies, they do the same sourcing year after year after year. And it's not like they're stupid. They have a lot of information about the supply base that they've learned. And they know, let's say, the oil prices in the world, how things have changed, how did these prices change, how did the legal rules change. So, and how much did other people pay for the same stuff yesterday and 2 weeks ago, and so forth. So they have a very good idea as to how much these items that are being procured should go for. But if you think about the reverse auction, the first step in that design is to ignore all of that information. So I'm going to throw out all of this information that I've collected over decades, and then I'm going to start from scratch as if I'm doing sourcing for the first time in my life. It just didn't make any sense. So that's why we want to take this prior information into account and do automated mechanism design on that. This doesn't mean that we're going to do Bayes-Nash, by the way. So it doesn't equate to us having to make common knowledge assumptions. You can still do dominant strategy mechanisms if you like. We'll talk about both Bayes-Nash and dominant strategy. And in the dominant strategy case, the bidders, we don't make any knowledge assumptions about the bidders, about what they know about each other. We just say that the designer knows things, and we're going to use what the designer knows. Does that make sense? Okay. So if you're really into mechanism design and know the history, you know Robert Wilson and the Wilson doctrine. He has a famous 87 paper that talks about detail-free mechanisms, that mechanisms should be detail-free. You don't want to take all of these details into account in the mechanism. If you think about the NASDAQ, yeah, I'll agree. You don't want to redesign the rules of the NASDAQ every day. But if you're talking about, let's say, a sourcing auction that runs once a year for $1 billion, you definitely want it to be specific to the details. So whether you want to use these completely detail-free things or not really depends on the application context. By the way, do interrupt with questions as we go along. So here's just a little note on terminology. So we are talking about automated mechanism design. That's totally different than what's called algorithmic mechanism design, which sounds similar and unfortunately has the same AMD acronym. But automated mechanism design is about designing the mechanism computationally. Algorithmic mechanism design is about designing the mechanism manually so that it runs in worst-case polynomial time. All right. So here's a picture of classical versus automated mechanism design. So classically, how you use mechanism design in practice is that you prove general theorems and publish and read other people's publications. Then you draw some insights from those papers. And then when the real-world mechanism design problem appears, you build a mechanism for it by hand. That's sort of kind of using the insights, but not really using the mechanisms from the papers. And then you get the mechanism for the setting at hand. So one example is spectrum auctions. So people do this in spectrum auctions, and what you end up with is mechanisms that are not incentive compatible and where nobody knows even one rational bidding strategy, one equilibrium bidding strategy. Yet you're running tens of billions of dollars of auctions that way. So that's kind of the classic way of doing it. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I mean, there's many arguments why you don't want to have incentive compatible mechanisms, but this is the approach. Here we're proposing a very different approach. Here we're taking the approach of building an automated mechanism design software once, and then we field the real world problem, we feed it into the software, and that spits out the mechanism for the setting at hand. Okay? And of course you can do hybrids. We'll say a few words about sponsored search, for example, where by and large the GSP at the high level came through this classical approach, and then nowadays there's automated mechanism design at all of the sponsored search companies where they tweak the parameters algorithmically in various ways. Okay, now I'm going to talk about three different kind of strands of automated mechanism design. The first of them is this flat representation strand, which was the first strand, and it's going to end up being very unscalable, as you'll see in a couple of slides. So don't walk out. There's going to be more scalable stuff coming. All right. So what's the input to this? It's a problem instance which is given by a set of possible outcomes, set of agents, and for each agent a set of possible types, and a probability distribution over these types, and a utility function converting type outcome pairs to utilities. And we use the word type instead of valuation because it's more general. So we can talk about things like voting mechanisms and so on. But in auctions, oftentimes the types are valuations. And if you're not used to thinking about what a type is, think about it this way. There are a number of utility functions. Think about a finite number for now. And they are common knowledge. Everybody knows what utility functions Nikhil might have. And we could think about the type as the index of the utility function. The first utility function that Nikhil might have, the second that he might have, and so on. And then we have a distribution over those numbers. Is it the first one? Is it the second one? Is it and so on? But well, only Nikhil really knows which of them he really carries. Any questions on the relationship between what the utility is and what the type is and what the valuation is? Okay. Oftentimes when we talk about valuations, we are implicitly in mechanism design assuming quasi-linearity, which means that the bidder's utility is the valuation of the goods she gets minus what she has to pay. So we'll kind of gloss over that implicit assumption here and there. It assumes risk neutrality, it assumes independence of money and goods and so forth. It assumes no externalities and so on. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that, but by and large, I'm going to just use both terminologies. Then there's an objective function, which gives a value for each outcome for each combination of the agent's types. So what the outcome is doesn't depend on just one guy's type, but on the whole vector of agents' types. And as Ellen talked about, there's this revelation principle that says that anything you can accomplish with any mechanism, you can also accomplish with a direct revelation mechanism. So you can think about types here or revealed types. They're essentially the same if everybody's motivated to tell the truth. And this could be, for example, payment maximization. But it could be other things, some sort of combination between revenue and efficiency, or maybe some notions of fairness baked in, and so on. Then we have 4 flags that talk about the restrictions of the mechanism. Are side payments allowed or not? So of course in auctions you have side payments allowed, that's kind of the whole point. If you're in voting settings, maybe you don't, maybe you do. So if you're voting for the president, maybe not. But if you're voting for whether you build a pool in your apartment complex or not, maybe there could be some payments to compensate the people who don't want the pool by the people who actually voted for the pool if the pool gets built. Is randomization over outcomes allowed? We'll talk about the power of randomization. Sometimes randomization allows you to generate better mechanisms. What concept of non-manipulability or incentive compatibility is used? So as Ellen was talking about, ex ante, ex interim, ex post. What participation constraint notion, if any, is used? What sort of individual rationality is used? Again, ex ante, ex interim, ex post. And by the way, sometimes none. Like, for example, if you're voting for the president in your country, even if you don't vote, they'll still become your president. So in some applications, you don't even need to worry about individual rationality constraints. Output. What's an output of the mechanism design? It's a mechanism which maps combinations of agents' revealed types to outcomes, and randomized mechanisms map to probability distributions over outcomes. It also specifies payments by the agents if payments are allowed. And it has the following properties. It's non-manipulable according to the given concept, satisfies the given participation constraint, and maximizes the expectation of the objective to the extent possible. Any questions on this so far? Okay. So let's try to drive home this issue, kind of why this might be a good idea. So let's say these are type vectors, one type for every agent at each point here. And there are some economic possibility results, let's say for quasi-linear preferences. For example, the Vitercik-Clark-Groves mechanism is a famous example there. If you have quasi-linear preferences, we have this, let's say we have this distribution over the joint types, this prior. If it's all in the quasi-linear preference space, then we have possibility. So we have a lot of, especially like, let's say we're talking about social welfare maximization, we can use the VCG for that and we're all good. Now, there are no impossibility results, as we talked about. So let's say we have this type of prior, this pink prior that spills over. By the way, there will be 2 here. The animation is a little off, looks like there will be points there. If you have this pink distribution, you might have impossibility, that it's not possible to achieve certain things. And then there might be some possibility that's unknown. Let's say this purple distribution. So we have the prior spilling out of the known island of possibility, but we still might have possibility. And if this is the case, the automated mechanism software will figure this out. And we might have completely different islands of possibility which are not yet known. And of course, the automated mechanism design software would figure that out too. Any questions on this? Yeah.
Yeah, this part that like within each you have multiple ones, like we know possible and impossible, but there are also some possible and impossible that we don't know. Is this correct? For each of these types.
I'm not sure I understood the question. So the possibility, let me just make sure we understand this picture. So the possibility is not for a type vector. The possibility is for the prior, which includes all of the bars, let's say all of the green bars. So if all of the green bars are on top of the preferences that are in the known island of possibility, then we have possibility for the prior. And for some of these things, let's say the pink one, there might be impossibility. Of course, that's not really known before you try it with the software, because we know that there's impossibility for a class, but that doesn't say that there's impossibility for a given prior. So you only know it after you try. The what? Well, I don't really think about it like that as like a summation of variables. I think about it kind of as knowledge. What do we know?
We know that there's certain classes for which we know something works from the literature. And then there are certain classes for which we know that there are priors in that class for which nothing works. But it doesn't mean that no prior in that class works. So there's kind of this gap between knowledge. And you're trying to fill in for that gap with a prior specific design. Yeah. Okay. So what the colors bars are, let's go through this one more time, because this is important. So what are the X's? These are type vectors, one type per player. So think about here, for example, player 1 has their first type, player 2 has their first type, and so forth. Player 1 has their second type, player 2 has their first type, etc. I'm just showing a small number of type vectors. This would be typically a huge space. Then, when we get the mechanism design problem, it says, what is the prior distribution over type vectors? One problem I might get in is this green problem, which is defined by these green histograms. And to your sums up to 1, what's summing up to 1? These bars are probabilities and they sum up to 1. Okay, are we good so far? All right. Now I might get a different problem as input, let's say this pink problem. And it might turn out as after I run my software that it's not possible to get some property for that prior. Then for this thing, this purple thing, which is another problem that I might get as input, I might get possibility, although it's spilling outside of the class for which all priors are possible. And I might have another island here, which is completely outside of the known possibility where things are possible. All right, any more questions on this? Okay. All right, so let's talk about complexity of this flat representation automated mechanism design. The following problems are all NP complete, even for just one buyer, for designing a deterministic mechanism. And why do we look at deterministic? Well, most mechanisms in the world are deterministic, and a lot of people like that. Randomization is kind of hard to understand, might be unfair exposed, etc. Okay, maximizing social welfare, which is the sum of the agent's values for their allocations when there's no payment allowed. Maximizing a designer's utility over outcomes with no payments. Maximizing a general objective, even just a linear one, that doesn't regard payments, although payments are allowed. And expected revenue. And these are all polynomial time for designing a randomized mechanism if we consider the number of agents as constant. If the number of agents is viewed as a variable, then it's exponential in the number of agents. So you can think about this as an LP, and these are IPs, integer program versus linear program. Now, when we talk about complexity in computer science, it's typically complexity as a function of the input size. That's kind of our notion, P versus NP and so forth. Now, here there's an additional problem, which is that the input itself is huge. So we have an exponential allocation space. Let's say that we want to allocate items, so each one of the items could go to any one of the agents or be thrown away. Furthermore, the support of the distribution over values might be doubly exponential, even for a single bidder. So think about it this way. Let's say for simplicity that we have at most k different price levels that the bidder can have for a given bundle. Then there are 2 to the items bundles. So the support size of my prior distribution, even for one bidder, is doubly exponential. It's k to the 2 to the items. Okay. So you're not going to be solving these problems for more than, let's say, 2 or 3 items, because you can't even represent the problem and give it. Furthermore, if you think about where would this type of information come from, you need a huge amount of information to collect it and store it and so on. All right, so that was the flat representation story. And it's interesting, but it's not very scalable. So now let's move to the second strand. And here, I'm actually introducing two new ideas at the same time. And this was a couple of papers that Anton Likodedov and my student Anton Likodedov and I wrote in AAA IO4 and 5. The two ideas is that first, you don't assume that you're given the valuation distribution as you would in an economics paper. Rather, you just get samples from it. Okay? So that kind of makes it, cuts through the doubly exponential prior problem. And the second is that instead of us starting tabula rasa from kind of a clean slate and designing from scratch, let's set up some family of mechanisms, and we're going to search through that family, and the family should have the property that it has good incentive compatibility and individual rationality properties, so that any point in the space satisfies those, and then we're just trying to find the point in the space that has desirable objective value, for example, high revenue. Okay, so let's talk about the sample part first. There's an unknown distribution over valuations, and we use a set of samples drawn from that distribution to learn a mechanism that has high expected revenue. You could say learn or optimize, whatever you like. And there's been a lot of work down that stream in the multi-item setting as well as a single agent setting. Here, what we want to do is that given a large family of mechanisms and a set of buyer's values sampled from the unknown distribution D, we want to find a mechanism with high expected revenue. And the approach that we'll take is that we want to find a mechanism that's good on the set of samples, and then we hope that it's going to be good on the real distribution, which we don't know. And then in the next part, Nina is going to talk about some theory that's talking about that hope and how you can make that provable. Okay, and maybe we're designing the optimal mechanism for the samples, or maybe we're just designing a nearly optimal mechanism. So here I'm going to talk about how do we optimize. And what's a sample here? You could have more refined notions of sample if you like, but here we're just saying that one sample is one draw of valuation for every bidder for every bundle. So this bundle, what's bidder one's valuation for the coffee, what's one's value for the muffin, what's one's value for the coffee and the muffin. And then so similarly for 2 and 3 all the way to agent N, bidder N. So that's one sample. And then we have capital N of these samples. That's our input, and then we're trying to find some mechanism that works well for that whole set of samples. Any questions on that? Yeah.
So do you have to assume that you have the same number of buyers and the same number of items, or can you generalize it to a stochastic number of buyers and items?
Stochastic. So I am not assuming here that the number little n and big N are the same. So I'm not assuming that the number of items and bidders are the same. Is that the question?
No, it's basically, let's say you can have different number of buyers in different samples. Like let's say some buyers don't show up sometimes. Okay.
Oh, okay. I think there's a little bit of a confusion what these samples are. So these samples are not bids. And it's very important that they're not bids. Because if they were bids, they wouldn't be true valuations. They would be somehow some sort of lies that the strategizing, lying through their teeth bidders have been giving you, taking into account that you're going to exploit their bid knowledge in the future and all that. So what is this prior? This prior is not, and these samples are not bids. This is the mechanism designer's knowledge. The prior is the mechanism designer's knowledge, and the samples are samples from that. So think about the sourcing team. I know a lot about the world and the prices and the supply base. These samples are samples of things could be like this, things could be like that. These are not bids. You might, there's a whole other problem on which there are several papers as to how do you take bids in a given mechanism, historical mechanism, and how do you go from that and figure out what the prior is. We've done some work on that, and a lot of other people have done work on that. That's not what we're going to talk about today. So you might be able to, in some settings, you can get information from the bids and invert it into this valuation distribution. And so great. If that's how you get your valuation distribution, do that. Or it could be from your gut feel. We're kind of agnostic as to where does the designer's information, the prior, come from? Question?
Are there any assumptions on D itself? Is it independent or can it be correlated?
So far, I haven't given you any theorem yet. So far, it can be correlated. We'll talk about different variations of this. Yeah.
You're assessing revenue on the sample. Are you also assessing incentive compatibility on the sample, or are you using the
Or am I using what?
Are you using the true unknown distribution for incentive compatibility?
I think you'll see that all of the mechanisms that we're searching over in this segment are incentive compatible. So that question kind of becomes moot. It's a good question at this point, but it'll go away. Other questions? And by the way, Ellen is going to talk about that question in more detail, and I'm also going to touch on that question a little later when we get to the third strand that I'll talk about. But in this strand, it's not going to be relevant.
Yeah, so I think one of the previous questions was whether the small n has to be the same across the samples, or it can vary for the number of pages.
Yeah, that was a question, but the answer was that these are not. So the question was really motivated by thinking about the samples as bids, but the samples are not bids. The samples are just. Think about the sourcing team's knowledge. They're just samples from that, and there they all have the same number of bids, same number of bidders. I mean, and the same number of items. I'm thinking about the auction that's coming up. I know what the items are that are being auctioned. I know who the bidders are that are registered in the auction. That's my setting. Yeah.
Can you give an example of how you get these samples? Because it feels like if you sample from your prior, then it's like you know the distribution.
So you know the distribution D. You might, well, this gets kind of philosophical. What does it mean to know? So you definitely cannot write it out because it's way too big. And you don't have enough brain cells to store it in your brain. So maybe you store it in your gut somehow magically. But there is this distribution D from which the samples are drawn. And what's actually drawn into the system from the experts is the samples, not the distribution. You might have it in your gut somewhere. But more realistically, you're actually creating the samples on the fly with a process where you said, okay, things could be like that, or things could be like this, or things like that. So you're kind of generating the samples on the fly. Yeah.
So in practice, can you give an example of how you might be generating those results? Since you're not using historical big data, you're simulating, you're saying like, oh, maybe their valuation is uniform distributed or some crazy distribution that you write down, but you really manipulate, or how you actually.
Okay, good. So I didn't say that you're not using the bids. I'm saying that I'm an agnostic where it comes from. So one way is that if, and this would be the most traditional way that people try to come up with these priors, is that they somehow analyze the equilibrium of some sort of existing mechanism. They look at the bids from that, and then they try to get to the valuation distribution from that. That's one way. Or maybe it's just like, it could be like this, it could be like that. We did some work in sourcing. Most of our sourcing, by the way, wasn't using the automated mechanism design yet. But we did some work in England on trying to say, okay, what do you think things could be? And they gave us a few scenarios how things could be. That's another way you could use this. Yeah, but we're kind of agnostic as to how you use that. Where do the samples come from? Yep. All right. The second thing that we're bringing in here in this paper was the automated mechanism design as a search in a parametric mechanism class. So instead of clean slate, full-blown start from scratch, empty table, put probabilities in a table like the LP and the IP approach, you take some parametric mechanism class and then you move a point in that search space. So here's a nice visualization. Let me go over it again. Boom. No? There. Okay. So I'm going to talk about what those parameters are that we're tweaking as we go along. And there might be many, and there will be many. All right, so now I'm going to go through a pretty cool class. We'll start kind of as a transformational analogy from the VCG, and then you'll see how we can actually tweak this and get much higher revenue while having ex-post incentive compatibility and ex-post IR. So the VCG is a fundamental building block for multi-item, multi-bidder mechanism design for deterministic mechanisms. And why do we want to look at deterministic? Well, because most mechanisms in the world are deterministic, and they're easier to explain, they're more palatable after the fact because you don't get randomization and so on. By the way, it doesn't mean that I don't like randomized mechanisms. And Ellen is going to talk about some results that apply to randomized as well. But here, I'm going to just talk about deterministic. They maximize social welfare, which is some of the buyer's values for the items that are allocated. And it's a generalization of a victory auction. Each buyer submits a bid for each bundle. If you don't like that, you can look at this whole literature called preference elicitation in combinatorial auctions that you can look at to get less revelation and still get exposed incentive compatibility. But we're not going to talk about that today. And this auction is going to be incentive compatible, so we can assume that the bidders' bids equal their true values. So there's no common knowledge assumptions or anything like that. And now I'm going to talk about an example, and many of you know how this works, but stay with me on the example because I'm going to start to transform from there to the new thing. All right, so we have this B1 through N are the bundles that bidders 1 through N get. They're all subsets of the set of items, and they're non-overlapping. Social welfare is the sum of the bidder's values for the bundle that the bidder got. B star is a social welfare maximizing allocation. By the way, social welfare we write as SW for short. So here's an example, 2 bidders, 1 and 2, 2 items, a cup of coffee and a muffin, and here are the valuations. So the optimal allocation here is to give bidder 1 both the coffee and the muffin because you get 2.5. And you can convince yourself that you can't get any better than that, no matter how you allocate the goods. Social welfare minus I is a sum of the other bidders' valuations in the allocation except agent I. So here, and B minus I is a solution that would maximize social welfare of the other bidders. So here, if bidder 1 didn't show up, so this column didn't exist, we would give either the muffin or both the coffee and the muffin to bidder 2. So this would be one of the optimal allocations. It's where bidder 1 gets nothing, bidder 2 gets both of the items. So in the VCG mechanism, we pick the allocation that maximizes social welfare, and then the payments, many of you probably know this already, but they are looking at the social welfare of the other guys, of the allocation that would have happened if I had stayed at home, minus the social welfare of the other bidders, given that I participated. So it's like you show up in the auction as a bidder, you're taking value away from the other bidders because of it, and you have to pay the amount of value that you take out from their pocket. Okay, so in this example, the social welfare, except for bidder 1, when bidder 1 didn't show up, is 1 here. Social welfare of the other guys, when bidder 1 came and took both items, is 0. So bidder 1 pays 1 minus 0, which is 1. All right. Do you see any problem with this? So if you're think about running this auction, and you're Starbucks, you're trying to maximize the revenue here. Do you see any problem with this? It's pretty low, yeah. Why do you say that? Exactly. So the valuation is 2.5, and you're only getting $1. So somehow, most of the surplus is going to the bidders. Could you actually gouge the bidders and get some more of that to yourself? Well, the idea here, that's exactly the problem. How can we get the bidder to pay more? what if we added an additive boost to the social welfare of the allocation that would happen if bidder 1 didn't show up? So let's say that I'm taking this and I'm adding 1.49 here. Then bidder 1 would pay 1 plus 1.49 minus 0, which is 2.49. Now I'm gouging almost all of the value. Okay? So that's what you want here. This is a very simple example, of course, so you said, okay, I may have been able to figure that out by hand if I had sat down for half an hour. But if you think about the multi-item auction, this is actually pretty tricky. So now, I'm going to give you a mechanism for doing that. But so this is the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism first. Compute the social welfare maximizing allocation, and then for each bidder in turn, find the social welfare maximizing allocation without that bidder's participation. And then we compute the payment for bidder I, or by bidder I mean, as we talked about before. So how much happier everybody would have been if bidder I had stayed at home. So that's the VCG. Now I can actually add these boosting terms per allocation, which I'm gonna call lambdas. So I can actually control, kind of artificially prefer some allocations over others. And now I have a lot of knobs that I can start turning and they affect revenue. Furthermore, what I can do, I can multiply the bidder's valuations with different bidder-specific multipliers, W. So I'm going to say, okay, Sven, I'm going to listen to his valuation more than I'm going to listen to Nickel's valuation, and so forth. Okay, now I have even more knobs to tweak. So I have exponentially many knobs here, lambdas, and a linear number in the number of bidders, W's. Here, exponent, yeah, okay. And this is called the affine maximizer auction, or an affine maximizer in mechanism design more generally. This was introduced by Roberts in 1979. The nice thing about this, let's talk about this first bullet first, that is affine maximizer auctions, which we'll call AMAs, are ex-post incentive compatible and ex-post individually rational. So even in hindsight, you're happy having gone to the auction, that's IR, and even in hindsight, you're happy having bid the truth, with your true valuations. So the proof is the same as for VCG, by the way, so you can actually go line by line. Everything goes through, even with these blue things in the picture. All right, the amazing thing that Roberts proved about this is that for an allocational auction, these are the only incentive compatible mechanisms. And it doesn't require any other properties, just incentive compatibility. So if you want to accomplish some other objective than maximizing this affine social welfare, you're not going to be incentive compatible. This is the only thing you can do in mechanism design. And when I say allocational auction, what I mean by that is that it's more general than a combinatorial auction. In a combinatorial auction, you care about what items you get and how much you pay. In an allocational auction, you also care about what happens to the items that you don't get. Who gets them? Your value depends on that as well. And furthermore, your valuation space needs to be unrestricted. So one example of an allocational auction that's kind of famous, there's a famous paper, How Not to Sell a Nuclear Weapon. So think about, 1980s, Iran-Iraq war. If Iran doesn't buy a nuclear weapon from somebody, they really care whether the nuclear weapon goes to Iraq or not, right? Another example where we saw this in a very concrete way is that we were doing sourcing of colorants for PPG, the world's biggest maker of car paints. And the number of colorants makers was 4. It's a huge auction, hundreds of millions of dollars in the auction, year ahead, 4 bidders, and they were selling different kinds of colorants. And they hated each other. Some hated each other more than others. So what I thought would be cool, in our sourcing software, we allowed them to say, okay, in addition to bid for the different bundles, we allow you to bid something so that some certain competitor doesn't get the business. So I might say, I'm going to bid this way. By the way, I'm going to give you $50 million if nickel doesn't get that business. Okay? So now they actually ended up using that feature quite aggressively. And the nice thing about the allocational auction is that the revenue, or cost in the sourcing case, is not capped by the valuations. You can actually get more revenue than the sum of the valuations. Anyway, so that's in the allocational auction. The only incentive compatible mechanisms are affine maximizers. That's an amazing result, right? You'd imagine that you might want to do something else than social welfare maximization, affinely transformed, but you can't. All right. Now, another cool result is that every incentive compatible multi-item, multi-bidder auction, combinatorial auction, so bidders only care about what they get and pay, is almost an affine maximizer auction with two qualifications. One is that you need a kind of an independence of irrelevant alternatives assumption and unlimited valuations assumption. So it sounds really true. There are combinatorial auction mechanisms that are IC and IR, but are not affine maximizers, but not that many. So that's why we're going to focus on affine maximizers. And the real reason we're going to focus on affine maximizers is because we can do something with them. But these are kind of motivations. Any questions on this? Okay. So now we have this parametric space. We also wanted to see with Anton as to, could we somehow generalize the idea of Meyerson's auction and virtual values into the multi-item setting? And we proved that you can a little bit, but only very little. So you have to have these virtual valuations that are linear, unlike in the single item case. And that's what we call a virtual valuations combinatorial auction. And as you think about it as a subset of AMAs, it's just an AMA with the extra restriction that the lambda on an allocation is replaced by the sum of the bidders of bidder-specific lambdas of bundles. So for every bidder bundle pair, I'm going to have now a lambda instead of having a lambda for every possible allocation. So it's a restriction, fewer parameters to optimize over. And this is, again, how it would look like in the full mechanism. And again, incentive compatible ICIR just for the same reason. Now let's talk about some computational considerations. First, some bad news. The expected revenue is not convex in the VVCA or AMA parameters. Here's a projection on a particular two-item auction. Y-axis is revenue. Here is how much I boost the mechanism for not allocating anything, so burning the two items. And here's how much I boost everything else. And you can see that it's this funny surface, unfortunately. Furthermore, there's no polynomial time algorithm capable of determining whether one parameter vector is better than another for all parameter vectors. There might be some parameter vectors for which it's easy, but in general, this requires you to solve the winner determination problem at least once, and it's easy to see that you can do it with two winner determinations. Okay. Good news for any given valuation vector, so any given sample, if you like, the revenue has only one maximum in any one parameter. And the expected revenue is continuous and almost everywhere differentiable in the AMA parameters. So that gives kind of two algorithmic ideas. One is grid search, where you have some sort of a grid and you evaluate the points using simulation, and then you might refine the grid around the best point and do it over and over. Or some sort of gradient ascent in the parameter space, starting, for example, from the VCG. And starting from the VCG is nice in the sense that if that's the benchmark you want to beat, this guarantees that you're at least not losing to your benchmark. And everything is uphill from there, or downhill, however you want to look at it. And in every point, whether we're talking about a grid search point or a point in the gradient ascent, is evaluated by simulating the auction revenue on the samples that you have. All right, so let's talk about algorithms in those families then and how well they do. So the first is what we call AMA. It's simplest search algorithm in the parameter space. So it's iterated grid search of the AMA parameter space with grid tightened and recentered around the best solution from the previous iteration. VVCA star is the same thing for VVCA parameters instead of AMA. Of course, this is not scalable to large problems because the dimension of the grid grows with the number of items exponentially. But this allows you to do things that really seeing what is the best mechanism or almost best mechanism for a setting, and it allows you to really look at things that you didn't know in manual mechanism design. What we saw is that we are overfitting already on the third iteration. And what do I mean of the grid refinement? What do I mean is that you do the grid, you pick the best point, you refine the grid, pick the best point, refine the grid, pick the best point around, and you always refine the grid around the iteration. And when using, let's say, 1,000 samples in the training set and 10 million in the test set, you actually see that on the third iteration, you're already starting to go downhill in the real revenue space, although you're thinking you're going uphill based on the training samples. We'll talk more about that. But still, with two iterations of this, you can get a very good idea of what the optimal mechanism is within the AMA space or VVCA space. It doesn't mean that it's optimal globally. In particular, we already saw 20 years ago with these automated mechanism design techniques that the optimal mechanism for combinatorial auctions in many cases has to be randomized. And the AMAs are all deterministic. So we know that we may be missing the absolute optimal mechanism here. Sven.
You say that it's not, the grid search is not scalable to large problems. What do you mean by large, what dimension, and how large, and why it's not scalable?
Yeah, so if you think about the lambdas, how many lambdas are there? There is one lambda for every possible allocation. So the grid search, the number of dimensions is equal to the number of allocations. So what's the number of allocations? It's number of agents plus 1 to the power of items. So you can pretty quickly see that as the number of items gets larger, it's not going to scale. So think about a handful. I'll show some experiments in a second. Handful on a good day, more like 2 or 3 on a bad day. And that's why we need the next algorithms I'm going to talk about. So then there's basic local search AMA, start at the VCG, which just means that the W's are 1 and the lambdas are 0, and then run gradient descent in the AMA parameter space. We ran Fletcher-Reeves conjugate gradient descent. The particular form doesn't really matter. Now the next idea is that can we somehow use economic insights to decide how to do better gradient descent instead of this naive gradient descent? And the high-level idea is that if a bidder pays in an allocation much less than her value, she should pay more. Coming back to this coffee example, instead of getting a $1, maybe we should get $2.49. And that's very easy to say when you have 2 items, but when you have n items, that's actually pretty gnarly. So how do we do this? So here's an algorithm for the AMA parameter setting case. We sample the valuations from the prior distribution. Then we start the parameters at the VCG. For every sample point, we compute the revenue loss on the winning allocation. That gives us an algorithm which we call ABMA star A. And if you could also think about doing it on the second best allocation, because that affects revenue, that gives us variation B. I'm going to show you results on both. The revenue loss from a bidder is the difference between the bidder's valuation and her payment. The revenue loss is the sum of the bidder's revenue losses. And the revenue loss of the allocation is the sum of the revenue losses of the samples associated with the allocation. So now I've computed the revenue loss for a sample point, or for all of the sample points. I'm going to make a list of allocations in decreasing order of the revenue loss. So I have the worst smelling allocation first, the one that has the biggest revenue loss, and so forth. Then I'm going to choose the first allocation from the list, call it A, and if the list is empty, I'm done. I'm at the local optimal. Then I'm going to run the gradient descent in the W lambda A subspace of the AMA parameter space. So I'm allowing myself to tweak the weights on the bidders, but only one of the boosts. So now I have a much, much smaller search space to look over. If the values of those parameters didn't change, we're at the local optimum with respect to them. We remove A from the list and we go back to 5 and pick the next allocation. If they did change, then we're going to go back up here and recompute everything. All right? The bidder bundling boosting VVCA algorithm is the same idea, but instead of optimizing the AMA parameters, it optimizes the VVCA, the virtual valuation combinatorial auction parameters. Now, what I'm going to do next, I'm going to show some experiments. First, kind of how much does this help on small problems where we can actually do the grid search. And then I'm going to talk about larger problems where the grid search is not scalable and we're going to have to go into this gradient descent type problem, algorithms. But before we go into that, any questions? Okay. So in this experiment, I'm going to talk about 3 different settings. They all have these properties, which is that we have 2 items and 2 bidders. The valuation for bidder I for item 1 and item 2 are drawn from a prior distribution with PDF f of I. And the value of the bundle is the sum of the parts plus some complementarity or substitutability term C. So it's not just assuming additive. Except in the first experiment, I'm going to assume additive, because there's been a lot of work on that. Each CI for bidder I is drawn from a distribution with PDF f of C. Now in the first setting, let's talk about this first. The items valuations are drawn uniformly from 0 and 1 independently, and there's no complementarity or substitutability. So this is the additive setting. By the way, I should say that it's amazing that people have been looking at this multi-item revenue maximization since at least 1980. So that's 40 years now. But nobody knows even how to do the 2-item case. Nobody knows how to sell an apple and an orange so as to maximize revenue. So if you kind of put that in perspective, it's not because people have been too stupid, it's just very hard. And that's actually one of the arguments why you want to have automated mechanism design in the first place. We're already stuck in trying to optimize revenue for 2 items. The special cases of the 2-item case have been solved. And there's some things where you have multiple items, additive, but only 2 support points, 2 valuation points, and things like that. But by and large, even the 2-item case is open. Now, what's the revenue of the VCG here? It's 2/3. The grid searches give a 32% and 31% lift over this. The local search algorithms give you a 17 or 18% lift. So they do get stuck in a local optimum. But it's still way better than VCG. In the setting 2, we have the valuations drawn between 1 and 2 uniformly for the items, and then we have both complementarity and substitutability, in that this term C is drawn from -1 to 1 uniformly. VCG gives you revenue 2.45 here, but you can get an AMA that's 14% better. And here, the local search algorithms do almost as well, so their local optimum is basically as good as the global optimum. Setting 3 is an asymmetric setting where we have F1 be between 1 and 2, F2 be between 1 and 5. So basically what we have here is that we have a strong bidder 2 and a weak bidder 1. And we have the complementarity and substitutability as well. VCG gives you 2.85. The grid search techniques give you a lift of 48%. And the local search techniques give you a lift of about 32%. So they do get stuck in a local optimum, but still significantly better than VCG. Any questions on this table? Okay.
What's the optimal revenue?
For which? I don't know. Who knows? Maybe for this somebody has figured out what optimal revenue is. Certainly not for these. Yeah, maybe somebody knows. I don't actually remember. Maybe somebody knows the optimal answer for this. I don't know if it's even known. What? Yeah, I'm going to talk about that. So I'm actually thinking, yes, Manelli and Vincent actually have a theory paper where this is solved. I don't remember the answer. 2006. So it was after we did our AAAI 04 and 05 papers. So if you want to look at that, they have an exact solution for that. I'll actually show you what the solution looks like. I just don't remember the revenue number by heart. But if somebody wants to look at that over the coffee break, you get your space in the spotlight here. You can, after the break, come tell us what the revenue number is for that. What? Exactly. Good. So let's talk about another thing here. Setting 1. We can actually use automated mechanism design to actually disprove conjectures in mechanism design. And the first thing that we did, this was work with Vincent Konitzer back 17 years ago. We looked at, is it true that optimal multi-item auctions have to be randomized? And that's had been an open question in manual mechanism design, but it's very easy with this. Basically, you just generate examples, and you'll say, okay, run it with randomization allowed, run it without randomization allowed, see if there's a difference. Within a couple of instances, we saw something where there's a difference. Thing is solved. Okay. Now, a newer result, this is in the Operations Research Journal version of these old papers that we have. We were looking at, in this simplest setting, as we move from MBARPs to VVCAs, is the revenue getting better? And as we move from VVCAs to AMAs, is the revenue getting better? Those were open questions. So what's an MBARP? An MBA, or a mixed bundling auction, it's an auction class by Jehiel et al., where you give boosts to all of the allocations where the items are sold together as a grand bundle, and you give the same boost. So it has this one lambda, if you will, which says that I'm going to favor giving it together. So I'm selling either all of the items separately or all of them together. And what's an MBA RP? It's a mixed bundling auction with reserve prices. This is a class that Ping Chong Tang, who was a postdoc of mine, and I introduced. We're taking the MBA class, but we're also allowing reserve pricing in there. So now you're getting this very simple form of bundling together with reserve pricing. And what can you do with that? That's a subset of VVCAs, way fewer parameters. So is there a gap? Is VVCA giving you more revenue than this? And in this class, turns out no. We're going from a polynomial number of parameters to an exponential number of parameters. No revenue lift there. But then generalizing further to AMAs gives a tiny amount of extra revenue lift. It's like in the 4th digit or something. So we know that VVCAs are not optimal, even for this setting, but they're very close to optimal. So it's interesting, going from VVCAs to AMAs, the number of parameters increases just slightly, but that's where the revenue lift comes from. All right, let's talk about scalability to answer Sven's question. Here, these are now problems where the grid search doesn't scale anymore. So these are all these gradient descent algorithms. This is 3 items, symmetric distribution, time on a log scale on the y-axis, number of bidders on the x-axis, and this is time to local optimum with each of the algorithms. The naive local search is the slowest, and the kind of economically guided are the faster. The one that optimizes the VVCA parameters is the fastest. And you can see that these curves curve down, they're not linear. So that means that we are highly sub-exponential in runtime, which is good, in the number of bidders. If we move to the number of items, we're actually exponential in runtime to local optimum. This is 3 bidders, symmetric experiments. Again, the same order of the algorithms, naive algorithm, slowest, and the fastest is the one where we tweak the VVCA parameters with the economic insights. And this is really the most important slide here. This is anytime performance on a 7-item, 7-bidder symmetric distribution. And now this is huge as far as combinatorial auctions go. When I say for mechanism design, in reality, when we were running these mechanisms, there were hundreds of thousands of items for sale. But then we were running predetermined mechanisms. We weren't actually using this type of systematic tweaking. So here's the revenue, runtime on the x-axis, VCG here. And you can see this desirable property that most of the revenue lift comes from early on in the algorithm, and then you get diminishing returns. And again, the algorithms that use the economic insights do better than the naive gradient ascent. All right, any questions on that second strand? And how much time do I have? Okay. Yeah. Items. Well, and it's actually a little bit funny because we have typically multiple units of the items too, but I'm just counting the items. So in the biggest auctions, hundreds of thousands of items, we had up to, biggest auction I think we did was 2 million bids. So the number of bundles would be bigger, but they weren't all populated by bids, but about 2 million bids. Yeah, I actually have a little slide on that at the end. We didn't use it much. This was kind of late in the game, very close to when the company was already being acquired and so on. So we didn't really use this much. But these were ideas that were motivated from that experience. We did use it in England in one project where it came up with very interesting mechanisms, and I'll talk about that. All right, any other questions on this second strand? So to recap, first strand was flat representation. Second strand was search in a parametric space where all of the mechanisms are good in some sense. And in particular, we talked about good in the sense of being exposed IC and exposed IR. Now we're going to move to a third family. And this is saying that, okay, we're going to start from some mechanism that's not IC. And then we're going to start to tweak it to be more IC. So it's a whole other direction now. And here's how it works. We call this incremental automated mechanism design, in that you're incrementally changing the mechanism to make it hopefully more IC and having other good properties. We start with some mechanism, typically manipulable mechanism. And in the two examples I'm going to show you, we're going to start from the most famous mechanism, the most commonly used mechanism in their respective fields. And then I'm going to start to tweak them to make them better, algorithmically. Then I'm going to find some set F of manipulations. And what's a manipulation here? It's given by an agent I, a type vector of all of the agents, and a better type report theta prime I for agent I in this type vector. So agent I would be better off lying if this were what they all said. So that's a manipulation. And here's some choice. It's some set F. Is it all of the manipulations? Is it one of them? Is it some of them? There's a lot of choice. So this is like a template. I'll give you a couple of instances in the next slides. If possible, we're going to change the mechanism to prevent one or more of these manipulations, maybe all of them, from being beneficial. And how do you make a manipulation not be beneficial? There's two directions. One, or A, you can make the outcome that M selects for theta more desirable for agent I, so he would be less incentivized to say theta prime. Or you could make the outcome that M selects for theta prime less desirable for agent I, so agent I would be less incentivized to lie and say theta prime. Or you could do a little bit of both. So there's again choice here in the template, and then you repeat from step 2 until termination. And what's termination? Well, that's another choice. Well, how does it terminate? Okay, here's one example. An application of incremental automated mechanism design to settings with payments. And so we're here looking at multi-item auctions. Our objective G is to maximize some combination of allocative social welfare, that's social welfare not taking payments into account, and revenue. Which combination doesn't really matter. The set F here of manipulations that we consider is that of all possible misreports by any single agent at a time. So we look at one person is changing at a time, and then we do it for all of the players, and that's our set F. We try to prevent manipulations according to idea A, approach A here. So for a type vector from which there is a beneficial manipulation, we make its outcome desirable enough to the manipulating agent to prevent the manipulation. And just enough. Not more than that. And among the outcomes that achieve this, we choose one that maximizes the objective G. And in one iteration, this designs the VCG, starting from a first price auction. So most combinatorial auctions in the world are run in a first price format. In particular, all of the sourcing auctions are. And if you start from that, you get the VCG in one step. Of course, you might say, well, that's just great. You just came up with something that's already known. And it's true. It didn't come up with anything new. But it's good that it came up with something that's good in some known sense. The second example is not in auctions, it's in voting. And here we are looking at cardinal preferences. So each voter has a cardinal order of the candidates, cardinal preference order of the candidates. And the set F consists of all manipulations in which a voter changes which candidate he ranks first. So we're going to start from the plurality voting mechanism, which is the most common voting mechanism. So how it works is that we're going to just look at the highest ranked candidate for every voter. And then we're going to say which candidate got most of those votes. Are you with me? Okay. So that's what we're going to start with, and that's highly manipulable. We're going to try to prevent manipulations as follows. For a type, which is a vote vector here, from which there is a beneficial manipulation, we consider all the outcomes that may result from such a manipulation, in addition to the current outcome, and choose as the new outcome the one that minimizes the number of agents that still have an incentive to manipulate from this vote vector. And we'll change the outcome for each vote vector at most once, but we'll have multiple iterations for vote vectors. And so that's our stopping approach. And what this does in multiple iterations, in a finite number of iterations, it designs plurality with runoff as the voting rule, which is a famous way to try to patch the non-incentive compatibility of the plurality rule. Of course, according to the Gibber-Satterthwaite theorem, this is still manipulable. So here you don't end up with something that's not manipulable because there's no such thing. But it comes up with something that's, in some sense, way less manipulable than the plurality voting rule. Any questions on this? All right. So now let me talk about incremental automated mechanism design via deep learning. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
So, what I didn't get is that it seems like two things are optimized at the same time. One is the incentive compatibility, right? And the other is the revenue optimization. And, but they may contradict each other. Is this controlled through the choice of subjective function or what?
Yeah, okay. So you're not talking about this voting. You're talking about the auction one. Yeah. So you are right in that here, the way we're controlling revenue is what I said here in this part, which is just when we're making it non-manipulable, we're making it just non-manipulable, not more than that. So we don't give up any extra revenue. So in that sense, the revenue optimization is baked into the incremental redesign algorithm, which is fixing non-incentive compatibilities. And it comes up with VCG, which is not maximizing revenue. So it didn't come up with a good AMA, it just came up with a basic VCG. But this is just one way to instantiate the template. You could imagine doing incremental automated mechanism design in many different ways, depending on how you instantiate 2, 3, and 4. So that's just a template. And here's one example. And if you wanted to do revenue maximization, I wouldn't advocate this. I would advocate doing something in the bigger space that ends up with a good AMA, for example, or a good lottery set, or things like that. All right. And related to that question, it's going to be very pertinent here in the next thing that I'm going to talk about. There's some work from the last couple of years by Duting et al. On using this type of incremental AMD approach through deep learning. So deep learning is a very powerful tool for coming up with these nonlinear functions. And I'm going to talk about how that can be used to design high revenue, almost incentive compatible multi-item auctions. And so this is in the vein of incremental mechanism design, in that it starts from something that's not incentive compatible, and then it tries to fix the non-incentive compatibility and comes up with something that's close to incentive compatible. All right, so what's going on? M items in additive bidders. And I think that the approach, the additive assumption is just so that there would be a small number of input nodes. You could imagine having some limited amount of combinatorial going on as well in the future. They have two neural networks. One is the allocation network. It takes from each bidder a bid for every item as the input. Then there are a few layers, I think 5 layers in the newest version. The output has a softmax saying that the allocation probabilities for every item sum up to 1. So this is just saying what's the probability that bidder 1 gets item 1, what's the probability that bidder n gets item 1, and so on. So you have these softmax blocks there, so that guarantees that the allocation is feasible. And I'm going to talk about how you train this in a second. You have another neural network, which is also a feed-forward neural network, same inputs here, and the output has a sigmoid that gives an alpha I between 0 and 1 for every bidder I, and that just says what fraction of the bidder's bid should the bidder pay. So this guarantees individual rationality. So the bidder doesn't pay anything more than his bid if we can make the thing incentive compatible so that they bid their true values. All right, so what do we do with this thing, or what do they do with this thing? We don't really need training instances that are labeled. So we don't need some sort of theorem that says that in this situation you do that, in that situation you do this. You can actually just give the feedback to these networks that says that, okay, what's the revenue on an instance drawn from the prior distribution? And how much regret does a bidder have for having told the truth? So there's actually another inner loop optimization going on here to determine the regret that the bidder has for having told the truth. And then in the objective for the neural network, we just say that you want to maximize revenue minus the regrets. And in fact, it's not really minus the regrets, it's minus the regrets minus a quadratic of the regrets as well to get a little bit of curvature to the space. And then they use the augmented Lagrangian method where they basically they've taken the regrets are 0, which is the incentive compatibility constraint. They put them into the objective again by saying maximizing revenue minus the regret squared. I can just keep drawing these valuations from my prior distribution. I keep feeding them into the network, and the network gives me feedback, how good, how good, how good. And then I can use standard neural network algorithms to optimize that objective. And in particular, they use ADAM. So with this, you get something that ends up being almost incentive compatible and high revenue. So this is your question as to you're trying to optimize these two things at once, and they have some cool curves that show that actually sometimes you're going uphill on one of them, and sometimes you're actually getting worse on one of them. But by and large, you're getting better on both. Okay, and here's an example of what it found as a sanity check. So this is the Manelli and Vincent Jet06 paper that's shown in these dashed lines. It's basically saying what's the allocation rule for, I think it's a one bidder case. Yeah, so actually, this is just I lied earlier. I said that Manelli and Vincent solved the setting 1 that I showed you, but that's not true. They showed the setting 1 for the single bidder case only. So this is what it is. You have 2 items for sale, 1 bidder, both valuations are drawn uniformly 0, 1, no complementarity or substitutability. The optimal mechanism has these types of allocation boundaries, where we have on the x-axis, we have the valuation, the bid for item 1, y-axis is bid for item 2 from that bidder, and this is a probability of allocating item 1, red is allocate, white is not. This is the probability of allocating item 2, red is allocate, white is not. And what this neural network-based approach found is this red versus white thing. So this shading is from the neural network, the dashed line is from the Manelli and Vincent analytical paper. So you can see that pretty much the neural network approach found something that's very close to optimal as a mechanism. And note again, there is no prior knowledge that's baked in here. You can also, and they do this in the paper, if you have some characterization results that say that, okay, the optimal mechanism must have this property, or an optimal mechanism can be restricted in this way without loss of generality, you can bake those things into the network. And they do some of that. All right. Some other ideas. Now I'm going to need to speed through this pretty quickly. And now we kind of ended the three approaches section here, and I'm just going to talk about some separate ideas. Here, setting single item non-valuation distribution with finite support t to the n. We can write the single item revenue maximization problem as an LP, as we talked about. If you want to have a base Nash incentive compatible mechanism only, not exposed, you get this. And there's still t to the n variables. But the idea is that instead you can optimize over the interim variables in the single item case. So this is not for multiple items, where the variables are the expected probability bidder I receives item I given bid VI, and the payments bidder I's expected payment given VI. So for one item you get this nice cut down on the complexity in that the number of variables is linear instead of exponential, and so is the number of constraints. This can be in a certain way generalized to multi-item additive bidders, so not combinatorial. Runtime, it remains polynomial in the number of bidders and polynomial in the distribution support size, but that's exponential in the number of items, even in the additive case. And in the non-additive case, it's doubly exponential. Okay, another idea, optimal transport. The setting here is again fairly simple compared to what we talked about before. Have a single additive bidder. Single means, of course, that there's one bidder. Additive means that the valuation for the bundle is the sum of the prices of the items in the bundle. Main result, revenue maximization has a dual in optimal transport. And what's that? It's about moving mass from one distribution to another, and the dual is tight. Useful consequences. Every optimal auction has a certificate in the form of transportation flow, and that can help verify whether candidate auctions are optimal. And this can be a tool for characterizing optimal multi-item auctions. In particular, they studied conditions under which a take it or leave it offer for the grand bundle is optimal. All right. Sponsored search. There's been a lot of work on sponsored search, various types of automated mechanism design to tweak the parameters of the GSP. We did some work on looking at expressiveness and came up with a new kind of premium mechanism where you can do 2 bids, one for the top slots, one for the rest, and that has some revenue benefits. Google actually adopted this for a while. I think they've turned that off. I helped Baidu redo their sponsored search auction with some of this stuff. Ostrovsky and Schwartz were optimizing reserve prices in Yahoo sponsored search auctions. It's related to some of the overstock liquidation reserve pricing stuff that we did. Reinforcement learning for ad auctions. There's a whole sequence of papers by my past postdoc Pingsong Tang called Reinforcement Mechanism Design. He's been using that at Baidu and other places. And I just heard yesterday about a new paper, which I haven't yet read, boosted second price auction for Google's display ads under revise and resubmit. So there's a lot of work on sponsored search. I'm sure there's more than what's on here. These companies are typically pretty secretive about what they're running in production, but at least you have something to look into if you want. All right. And automated mechanism design isn't just for sales mechanisms. It can be used for other things as well. So combinatorial public goods problems, we've done some work on that. Real-world industrial sourcing mechanisms. Back to Sven's question, we were doing this sourcing event, a large-scale sourcing event in terms of price, but small in terms of items and bidders. A British company was buying most of the world supply on A and a little bit of B. And the competition situation in A and B was very different. And the system allowed us to automatically tie in a non-trivial way the allocation of A and B to the bids of the other, which was kind of interesting. So while there was no real complementarity or substitutability in any sort of physical sense between A and B, the mechanism ended up tying them together so as to reduce sourcing cost further. Divorce settlement mechanisms, reputation and recommender systems, facility location, and that's actually the same as product portfolio selection for the future. Very interesting things there. Assignment mechanisms, mechanism design without money, and redistribution mechanisms. There's a whole literature on redistribution. Redistribution is very difficult, and that's actually, together with combinatorial auctions, one of the real success stories of automated mechanism design. So let me leave it at that. And so to recap, I was talking mostly about the kind of philosophy and algorithms for automated mechanism design. How do you optimize mechanisms? And now Nina is gonna talk about the question that I said hope. We hope that as you, in the second approach, the sample-based approach, if you optimize on the samples, you're gonna get revenue that's close to optimal for the real distribution. Now Nina is gonna talk about our theory about how to actually prove that that is true.